Welcome back to the Information Week News Desk, coming to you live from Interop ITX. I'm Sarah Peters. Our next guest spoke this morning about how identity is changing and the rise of self-sovereign identity infrastructure using blockchain. She is the founder of Identity Woman, Kaliya Young. Kaliya, thank you for being here and talking about something I love.
Excellent. Yeah, happy to be here.
So a number of different organizations are starting to build identity infrastructures using the blockchain in some way. So let's just start with the question of why is blockchain useful to identity infrastructure?
Great question. So blockchain's useful because it solves a problem we haven't been able to solve without it. I've been working on digital identity and solving it for individuals for 15 years. So we've been looking around and we weren't like blockchain people. Like, blockchain was useful for some of its qualities. So the fact that it's a distributed database that's stored around the world and that there's one copy of it, right? Like, it's this sort of, it's both centralized and decentralized. Like, there's when you update the ledger, each block sort of solidifies what you put in it, and it can't be erased, and it's maintained forever. So that's a really interesting quality if you don't want information to disappear. And the identity community has been working on innovating a standard called decentralized identifiers. So individuals create their own identifier on their, with software they control, and then they can put it into a distributed ledger, and then they own it forever. This is an alternative to sort of like what we have now, which is you can be in someone else's namespace, like Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, and you have a username and password. You can rent a URL. You can rent a phone number. But all those types of identifiers, you aren't actually the controller of the identifier. With this new infrastructure, with a decentralized identifier standard, and then using the blockchains to store them, you own it.
And that's what you're talking about when you're talking about self-sovereign. That's different than having a bank give you an identity. This is something where you decide what your identity is, what kind of claims you're going to share about yourself.
Right.
Correct?
Yeah. I mean, you still can use this infrastructure to talk to banks, right? So it's useful in the real world. But you're ultimately the controller of the identifier, which puts you in control in ways that haven't been possible before.
So how is it being used now? What kind of services are out there, and how is the individual person putting it to use?
Right. So we're on the cusp of super early adoption, right? Like, I can tell you about pilot projects. But one of the ones that really impressed me was that made me go, okay, this is going to happen, was an application to support individuals logging into their credit union. Right? I was like, oh, it's an app on the phone. It's hidden all the complexity of the decentralized identifiers and the public-private keys. Normal people don't see that stuff. That's all buried in the apps. But it's the infrastructure that makes those apps work in new ways that are innovative, that really center people and put them in control.
I know that there's also blockchain-enabled identity infrastructures being used, for example, by the UN has a project using it to help create people who've been displaced, like refugees, to give them a new digital identity that they can use somewhere where there really isn't an identity infrastructure.
Sure. I mean, it's hard to figure out how real those projects are and what they're really doing. Another piece of it is that, like, you could use the blockchain if you're an institution to issue an identifier to a person, and then that identifier can be read by other institutions the person is interacting with, but they may not ultimately be in control of that identifier, right? So it's more like a portable identifier used across a family of UN institutions. There is no like large-scale public deployment of self-sovereign identity. There's small pilots. There's a pilot in Africa where under the ICSO Foundation, where they're supporting the disbursement of aid to children who are attending daycare. And so they're keeping the attendance logs using self-sovereign identity, and the parents have identities, and the teachers do. And then the payments get paid out based on the attendance logs that are recorded.
I find it amazing. I kind of love it. But two questions. Why has it been so difficult to create this? Well, no. Why? Not why has it been so difficult to create this before now,
Yeah.
but why is it still difficult at this point? And how much further do we have to go until it becomes this real thing? Because you're saying we're still at the pilot
Yeah,
level.
it's still
So
the
what do we
pilot
need
stage.
to do before we're all just having self-sovereign identities
Everywhere.
and throwing verified claims around and
Throw
doing our
verified
thing?
claims. Verified claims are really cool because long numbers aren't really interesting. It's like actually what do we know about you, and how do we support that happening? So the Decentralized Identity Foundation actually was spearheaded by a gentleman at Microsoft. You've got IBM really involved and looking at how they can support this new infrastructure, and selling it to their client base, right? Like they're servicing large institutions all over, and these identity problems, like how do you get identities to people? How do you have digitally native identities to be able to verify? Because right now we're sending faxes and scans of our passports and our driver's license around. So how
It's
do I
not
get a
ideal.
digital version of those things and use them? I think, before the end of the year, you'll see this come into production and actually released to like people. And if you can solve the chicken and egg problem, like if you could get large networks to flip over and turn all the, instead of being under a certain service, to be like, oh, now you all have self-sovereign IDs, that
Then
would be
we're
really
there.
cool.
Well, Kaliya, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for coming by. Kaliya Young, don't move. We've got more News Desk right here after this.
Thank you.